I declare open this hearing of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Economics as part of its inquiry into home ownership, and I welcome everyone. We are continuing our hearings for the home ownership inquiry here in Canberra today, and we'll be discussing the complex issue of whether the current policy settings give all Australians a fair chance to become home owners. We'll be speaking today to a number of key industry organisations and other stakeholders, which include Evolve Housing, Housing Industry Association, Urban Development Institute of Australia, Master Builders Australia and the Australia Institute. On behalf of the committee, I now welcome representatives of Evolve Housing to this hearing. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Yes, my name is Andrea Galloway and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Evolve Housing, based out of Parramatta in Sydney.
Now, I must remind you that although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, the hearings are legal proceedings of the Parliament and warrant the same respect as proceedings of the House. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. Would you like to make an opening statement of no more than 5 minutes before we proceed to questions?
Yes, I would. I just want to thank the committee for opportunity to appear about the important conversation for Parliament to have a critical area of societal policy. I wanted to talk about a description of affordable housing and include in its place social and private rental. I'm not sure if many of you understand what that is, but realistically it's where people are priced out of the marketplace, specifically in places like Sydney and major cities. It's getting to the point where people are spending probably 60% of their income on rental. Our goal as a not-for-profit community housing provider is to move people through the system where possible, where the actual house is not the destination. There is disconnect between social and affordable. From a social perspective, the residents pay 25% of their gross income, no matter what their income is, and the affordable pay a percentage of market rent. And there is no pathway for the people to move from social to affordable. If a person chose to do that, then they would actually lose their place on the waiting list, and that is something that no one wants to do, with the waiting list being sometimes 10 to 15 years. So Evolve Housing, we manage about 4,000 properties. We own about 500 of those. Most of those properties are in the Western Sydney area and the southwest area. We do have a JV in Tasmania for another 1,100 properties. Of those, we own about 500. We manage some on behalf of New South Wales social housing or public housing, about 2,000 of those. We also manage in the private sector additional 600 or so. We are the largest supporter of NRAS and affordable. We manage about 800 of those incentives or own those, and we ensure that we get the right people in those, like police, nurses, etc. The challenge we have sometimes with that, however, is that the thresholds that are there for incomes are not reasonable in a place like Sydney. When you set those at, say, $70,000 to get into an affordable property, then the income from a person like a nurse working overtime or a police officer working overtime, they move above that threshold. And I know an example like Warringah, when I speak to Warringah Council in Sydney, they have 3 police officers sleeping in cars because there's no affordable housing in that area, and they get to miss out on those essential workers. They have people busing down, say, from Newcastle to work in hospitals. So I just wanted to say that my first point really is about what housing is. It needs to be a continuum. It should not be a set and forget scenario. People should be able to move through the system so they become less and less reliant on government and more economically stable themselves. Their policy right now restricts us from doing that, and I think we need to work together from a federal and state perspective to put these services. We also need to work with other states and the federal around transparency on financial backgrounds around people, for instance. Right now, when we're trying to house people, there's minimal information we can get to see if they're the right people in those particular scenarios. We need access to information like tax returns or if there's overseas properties and those kinds of things, because we want to ensure that the right people go into housing so that we can move them through. As I said, it has to be a whole-of-government approach, and there's lots of policies around that can be set in that scenario. So I'm open to questions if the committee permits.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for your opening statement. You covered, with that example of the policemen sleeping in cars, which is a terrible situation in Warringah, an area I'm familiar with, and the difficulty of providing affordable housing in Sydney in particular. Are there areas that are ideal to pursue the provision of affordable
I don't think there's there's not ideal. It needs to be what I consider across all LGAs within that area. And I'll give you an example. There's probably about 560 suburbs in Sydney. And of that, if you're on minimum wage...
sorry, I was meaning across Australia. Areas across Australia, sorry.
Yeah, across Australia. Well, obviously...
You talked about having properties in Tasmania where real estate's much lower.
Yeah, obviously it's the capital cities that have the problem around affordability. And if there are places... Tasmania doesn't have such a problem as, say, Sydney would have or New South Wales. The affordable problem becomes exacerbated when it's around areas of labour and work, like mining towns, for instance. So there's pockets in Queensland that are unaffordable, pockets in New South Wales, definitely pockets in Western Australia. But the problem you have is that in those pockets that it is affordable, it's hard for a person to find a job. And affordable people have jobs, and I think that's the difference that people are not aware of. They earn a salary, whereas people in social housing don't necessarily earn a salary. They can, or they're on some sort of benefit. So they've got to have the jobs, and usually in those places, to be honest, there's not the jobs, but there's affordable housing.
You advocate in your submission that a shift from government-owned housing to community housing, including some transfer of ownership. How will this improve efficiency in this sector?
A couple of things, if I can just talk through that. Governments, let me first say there's a lot of unused and underutilised land out there, and I think there needs to be some sort of database of understanding how to use that land. And if we had access to land, we could actually create greater affordable outcomes for people. The community housing sector understands our residents. We understand their needs. We look at it from an umbrella perspective. So we actually provide the wraparound services required to move them through the system. Whereas I don't think the government actually does the wraparound piece of that. We also have the ability to work with the private sector in a relationship where we can have mixed tenure type models. So if we do a development, for instance, you can have partly social, partly affordable, partly private, all salt and peppered through that particular development, so that you can start trying to look at breaking the third intergenerational unemployment, etc. So we do a number of things. Wraparound services is key. Being able to partner with the finance sector, being able to partner with developers in creating outcomes across the spectrum.
In a situation where people improve their circumstance, there's two parts to this question, I think, and could actually possibly look at entering the housing market, who are happy with where they live. Mm-hmm. Has there been any strategies looked at to have those people be able to purchase the place that they're occupying?
We can't even purchase the place to actually increase the density, to be honest, because it's valued as an asset to the state if they're living in, say, social housing. It's not really an asset to the state. It's actually a service that is provided, and you couldn't realise that asset unless you sold it, and you can't do that. So there is no programs to date. In fact, the policy itself, social housing policy, doesn't provide a pathway. Like the federal provides social, you pay 25% of your gross income no matter what in a social house. That is no incentive for you to move through the system. We have, for instance, 10% paying market rent, and they choose to pay market rent because the safety net to them is, if I lose my job tomorrow and I have to go on a pension, then I'm only ever paying about $100 a week for that home. So it's a real disconnect. So there's no opportunity for them to buy the home. There's also an opportunity for us to actually redevelop it. And I'll give you an example, say an elderly lady or a man who's been in a home for 30 years, it's in a 3-bedroom home, they're part of community, they should stay part of that community. And how we can do that is to redevelop those large lots that are there, these post-war homes, create a bit of a higher density, put them in a smaller home and house more people either through affordability or social, even some private. That has not been an option for us at this point in time, and we need to make it that way.
And if you had ownership of these properties, would you be able to look at that type of development?
Absolutely, because we have very strong relationships with banks. You could actually, you can leverage against that, especially in a mixed tenure environment. Obviously, the yield from social is not there, but if you truly salt and pepper with mixed tenure, you can sell part of the private to actually sustain and afford the yield difference on affordable and social. But it's much more than that. It's about breaking the cycle for those people in living together in a community that's diverse. So people see them put their tie on every day or their shirt and go for a job. That breaks that intergenerational. We as community housing providers have the ability to work with financial institutions to do that.
Stop the ghettoing of disadvantaged.
And the vulnerable and isolation of that. And we can do lots more reurbanisation.
So, Andrew, have you had discussions with state housing departments about trying to fast track or see where they're able to change the way in which they hold stock and transfer it?
We've had many conversations, as you probably know, with state government. There hasn't been, the policy is still lacking, but it's also, we've talked about long-term leases as well, so we can leverage some of the forward revenues. But as I mentioned before, the state views the asset as a AAA, affecting a AAA rating, but it's not. It's really a service to the public, and it can't be realised. We could actually realise and decrease the age of the asset by renewing it and having mixed tenure. We've had long conversations with them. We've even put in some Premier's innovation initiatives about reurbanisation and changing places like Mount Druitt and changing places like Liverpool and creating that mixed community. But the decisions still haven't been made as to how that happens with CHPs.
So can you just clarify, when you expressed that the state government see this as a AAA, how did you describe it?
Well, what happens
can you just clarify on that, why that is being seen as an impediment to the transfer from being held within government to organisations like yours that can actually change, it will have a big impact on neighbourhoods like the ones I represent?
Yeah. Well, it's actually told us that if they actually were to give title away to, say, community housing providers, it would affect their AAA rating because the $32 billion asset that they have contributes to that. And my point is, it's not really an asset. To me, to anyone, it's a depreciating liability, and it also can't be realised unless you've sold it. And that's not. You can't do that when you're supporting 120,000 homes and 500,000 people. So that's where they link it to the AAA. I don't believe that is a true statement.
But is Evolve's model or preferred model in these type of discussions that it's a transfer without any price tied to it, or is it that you see yourselves entering into a commercial arrangement with state governments that you transfer the asset over at an agreed price?
Well, you can do a number of things. One of the models I think that could work is and with the planning controls in some of these larger cities, and you're getting higher density, and I'm talking about density done well, you could take most of these social houses in every state you look at are on large super lots, post-war and all that kind of stuff. The zoning now has allowed you to uplift that. So let's say you had 5 houses in a row that were public houses. The zoning may let you turn that into 20 homes. Right, so we should have the opportunity, and this is a very simplistic model. You either give us title, and we create 4 or 5 more homes with an uplift. But the model I think that would work is you actually give us a license to develop on those 4 or 5. You value it first, and so let's say it's $5 million, $1 million each for the houses. You value it first and say, give us a licence to develop it. You then turn that 5 into 20. You give them back the 5 because you've obviously now decreased the age of the asset and maybe one more, and you've now decreased the social housing waiting list. You then create some affordable and you make the project work because you sold 12 to the private. So that's no effort for government.
So what you're saying is if you redevelop those lots, you would be able to transfer the value, return the value back to the state government on sale, but you've created a higher density in the process.
Correct.
Yeah.
And a mixed tenure. Right? So you've created social, affordable and private, which is really important about moving people through the cycle.
And when have you put that approach to state governments? What type of, if you have, what type of response have you received?
Well, I think the Premier's Innovation Initiative, I think 600 people put responses to government, and we're still awaiting the decision on that. One of those, the concept I just told you is one of those models, but we haven't heard back from government on any proof of concept or any way forward.
But outside of the mechanism you just mentioned in relation to this innovation avenue, is there any other formal dialogue that allows you to put these type of ideas directly to government and then receive a direct response? Because these type of concepts would improve affordability, particularly for low-income people, or being able to access housing. And I've seen some of the work of Evolve, and it is of high quality. Being able to access that would be a huge benefit to people on low incomes. Why? I just can't see why there hasn't been any move to address this.
Well, I think the rhetoric back, to be honest, is there's no social housing policy to support it. So you can put in an unsolicited proposal, and probably there's that many in there, but they're not going to be addressed until a social housing policy is announced, and that hasn't been announced. So that's been on the cards for about a year or so. So we've been trying to do it separately to government, and that's how Evolve actually has grown its balance sheet, is to work within the sector to make it happen. So we're working with local government areas around unused land, for instance, and providing uplift to community amenity, and at the same time working with developers. But if we actually had access to government innovation and ideas about using land, etc., creating space like that, it would be much more flexible.
Okay. Do your organisation's engagement with NRAS?
Oh yeah, that's for us. And I didn't mean to cut you off there. NRAS is such an important part, and I really thoroughly believe it should never have been called NRAS, because when you say it's a scheme, everyone will try and work a scheme, if you know what I mean. It should have been an incentive to create more affordable housing. And the people who've been able to deliver on that is community housing. We are highly regulated, we are highly compliant, transparent, and have good governance with skills-based boards. So if you're going to pass incentives for people to look at putting people in there like key workers or city makers or essential workers, the group that can make that happen is community housing. The incentive should not be given to, I don't believe, student accommodation or those kinds of things. It should be given to the true city maker environment. We have about 800 NRAS.
Right, okay. I understand the government's going through a review process of the way in which the program's being managed. Have you been caught up in any of the delays in that?
Yes, and it's been very, very, very frustrating. The compliancy and the backward movement on the incentive compliance has been horrific. In line with that, the portal has been down consistently for us to be able to put that in there. Rules and regulations around initial NRAS then changed, and I'll give you an example. One is when we put an incentive on a property. Prior to this, we used to give a market rent, and it used to be between two numbers because it's very hard to define. Let's say 320 to 350. We always picked a median number in the middle. The new compliancy is we have to go back now, and we're non-compliant because we didn't provide one figure. And also in our rentals, we actually rounded up in our system, and in cases where 1 and 2 cents over the 80%, we've been considered non-compliant. So to me, there needs to be
Sorry,
a bit
for
more.
what quantum if you've made an error? Are you talking 1 or 2 cents, did you say, or percent?
1 or 2 cents. If we've rounded up and we've charged, say, instead of $300 a week, it's been like $300.50 over that year, it's more than 80%. So therefore, they consider that incentive non-compliant, and you don't get paid the incentive.
What's the impact on your organisation of that ruling of non-compliance?
Huge. Not only on our organisation, but on the developers that we've worked with. If you're looking at state component about $2,500 in incentive and the federal component about $7,500, and we've got 800 incentives, that's a big part of your balance sheet.
Yeah. And there's no mechanism to be able to review that and quickly address it and allow that type of impact to be diluted?
I'm meeting with the NRAS head today after this meeting to work through some of the 14, 15 scenarios. The 13, 14 ones have been very hard to make happen as well. And I think we're on a pathway now, but that kind of program is really, really important. And if it was effectively rolled out, it'd have incredible results in affordability of homes. And as I said, it should be with community housing, though, because, as I said, we're very well regulated and we are a for-purpose, not-for-profit.
Yep.
So any of our surpluses go straight back into creating more housing. So rather than lining other people's pockets, for instance.
What's the people impact? I mean, I can appreciate from your organisation's point of view that this would be hugely frustrating, but what's the impact on people seeking affordable housing as a result of these type of hold-ups?
Well, it's really sad, really, because it's not just a hold-up of that, it's the income levels as well. As you know, in Sydney, the prices have risen incredibly. So when you're valuing a product at market rent and then you're doing a discount to market rent, sometimes if a person, even a family of 2 children earning $110,000, don't qualify because it's too much of their income to afford that. So it's an exacerbated problem across the board. Affordable housing is so important to create the community. We have waiting lists of people trying to get in all areas, and the program needs to continue. And I think we need to work from both a federal and state perspective and a local perspective around things like inclusionary zoning, and things like the Section 94 is very different. Right now, there's no inclusionary zoning to create affordable units. Each local council is very different. In New South Wales, for instance, there's $1 billion sitting there in Section 94s that were taken from developers. It would be nice to be able to utilise some of those Section 94 monies to create more affordable housing. That is what I believe it was meant for, and it has not happened.
And a few moments ago you made the comment that it was important for the program to continue. Is Evolve under the impression that there may be threats to the continuance of the program, of the NRAS program into the future?
Not the current incentives, but as you know, it was announced last year that NRAS 5 was the last round, and we had about 1,200 incentives that were ready to go on that, and it was terminated. So we have NRAS from rounds 3, 4 and 5, and we're delivering on all of those. That will stay. That will stay. But the problem is that we're going to have to really... the compliance and requirements around that is so arduous now. I used to have one person doing the compliance. Now I've got 3 full-time people. And it's very, very difficult when the portal's down and those kinds of things. The current rounds, I believe, will continue, and I think they'll probably end in 2026 in June. But there needs to be another like program, not a scheme, an incentive program that allows people to create additional affordable housing.
Okay. My final question is, if you had the opportunity to influence policy in a key way to ensure people could move out of the old-style public housing onto a pathway of owning their own home, what type of mechanisms would you put in place to ensure that could occur?
Well, firstly, I think the 25% of gross income that Centrelink for housing is inappropriate because it really, to me, should be 25% of the amenity. So no matter if you lived in Dubbo you pay $100. If you live in the Vaucluse, you pay $100. And I don't think that's actually fair in the overall scheme of things, especially if affordable, you pay a % of market rent. So from a policy perspective, I think that needs to be addressed. There needs to be a transition between social and affordable, and you can do that by both hanging a carrot and having strict rules around your ability to stay in social housing. So I would say let's have a fixed term. If you put wraparound services, say, for 5 years, and they know that they're only going to have that home for 5 years, then there's programs that they'll work to. If you think you're going to have that home for more than, say, 5 years, you probably won't work towards a program. Also, there needs to be an incentive to move out. So let's say you gave someone in a social house $5,000, for instance. We'll assist you move. We'll move you into an affordable home and go through that pathway. And by the way, if you lose your job within 12 months or 2 years, you go back to the same number on the waiting list, all right, as your safety net. Right now, they go to the bottom. There's no pathway for them. So no one will move out of their home to be able to do that.
Thank you.
Make sense?
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your submission. How many of your clients work?
Probably less than 20%.
Less than 20.
Oh, in the social, 100% of affordable, 100% of affordable work.
Yeah.
They're the ones who are paying 74 or 80%. In the social perspective, only about 20%.
Okay. Of that 80-20 mix, how many of them are eligible to work? How many of them are retired? Just help me understand the demographic.
Of our resident base, 32% are on the disability support pension.
Yeah.
And that can be around a physical disability or intellectual or mental, etc. We have about 20% that are working, and the remainder of that are in the aged scenario, getting a pension and living, they're over 55. Probably most are over about 65.
So about 45-50% would be in the age sector.
Yeah, and it's getting actually quite worse, especially for women in that middle mature age, around 55 to 60, where they probably don't have a lot of money in their super, don't have the capability to work like they used to be able to work, or maybe they raise children, so they're becoming more and more homeless in that middle-aged area for women in particular. And I think that's going to be an evolving scenario. We see more people homeless.
Yeah, we went through a thing in a situation not that dissimilar in Queensland, where we had that that ageing demographic in supported housing, and it was a pretty torturous time, because they did a restructure where that we had ladies that had lived in these houses, 3 and 3 bedroom houses, raised families, but the kids had gone, and one person was living in a home that could house a family, and so they started to relocate them into newer, modern accommodation that was more suitable for one, to free up that level of housing. Do you find the same challenges down here, or that you've got nearly 50% of age pensions, single women?
Yeah. It's a huge problem. There's lots of underutilised homes, but I have a view on this, and that we need to utilise the land better. So a simplistic way in that scenario is I thoroughly agree we should move them, but I don't think you should move them out of the community.
Yep.
So one simplistic way would be on these large super lots or large areas of homes is to put granny flat in the backyard and have a family move in the front. That's simple. You could do it for about 50 or 60,000. That person is still in their community with probably the same address, but you've now got housing for someone else in the front. That's very simplistic, but that's actually not being looked at either. In the case in Queensland, I know there's large lots there. That would be probably an immediate kind of solution, rather than the development process, which takes 18 months, 2 years, when you're moving these people out.
So what would be the standard housing for this ageing demographic? Are they three-bedroom homes? Are they two-bedroom units? Are they single-bedroom bungalows? Or
The condition of the homes are terrible. The conditions of we actually, obviously as a community housing provider, we collect the rent, but we also get Commonwealth rent assistance. And out of that rent collection and rent assistance, we actually manage the property, we do all the responsive maintenance, we do all the planned maintenance over the asset life cycle. So as a community housing provider, we can maintain that property much more effectively than depreciating liability for government. The condition of the house, however, we need some flexibility around being able to, as I mentioned before, create the higher densities and to decrease the age of the asset by creating new.
understand that, and thank you for sharing with me the conditions. I'll try and ask it a different way. Describe the property to me.
Most of them are probably three-bedroom,
There we go.
asbestos-clad houses on large lots.
3-bedroom, large lots, 45% age pension, no longer family. How many residents would you have occupying a 3-bedroom home?
That's a very challenging question
No,
because...
it's not.
Yeah, because we actually
But you understand the point I'm getting to
Yeah,
about trying
absolutely.
to address an issue that poses an issue
Yeah.
immediately.
Yeah, so what happens...
I'm trying to drive you to a place
Yeah,
that fixes something immediately.
yeah. Probably we have about 200 of those homes.
Okay, no further questions.
Yeah.
Jim?
Thanks very much for your time this morning. I was interested in what you said about your relationship with the banks,
Yes.
because I'd like to know more about what sort of innovative financial products are either available or being talked about or should be being talked about to help people move along that continuum that you described. Some of the other witnesses that we've had have referred to various schemes around sharing the risk of default and all of that sort of thing. Can you just tell us your impressions of the products that are available or should be available in the financial system?
Yeah, should be available is getting access to institutionalised investment. And right now, has not been a pathway for super funds, etc., to invest in large scale.
Yeah.
I think that's important. So there has to be product around that. What
would that product look like? Sorry to interrupt you. But
It could be through some sort of housing bond that was guaranteed by government, and they've worked very well in the UK, for instance. And that model should be looked at quite seriously from a federal perspective. A guaranteed bond with a specific yield would be, I think that people would move into that. The banks themselves are still very, don't understand what affordable is in a lot of ways. A lot of our developments, they set the metrics fairly high. They want particular interest cover ratios of around 1.5. They want LVRs as low as 65 or 50 in some cases.
Yep.
So we need some more carrots there for the banks to be looking at higher LVRs, especially if you're looking at a takeout that includes private. I think access to interest rates that are low, and it could be supported by federal instead of base, points over base or something like that, and guarantee lower interest rates so it can create more housing. That would be an opportunity. Right now, we look at each project individually, rather than if we had access to a fund. We would be able to create additional housing outcomes for it. So right now, I think housing bond of some kind, guaranteed by government.
what are the
would be
obstacles to what are the obstacles to having housing bonds in Australia?
Right now, we've tried to approach government on it, and they won't guarantee it. And so it's very difficult for investors to look at a bond that's not guaranteed by government.
Right.
That's been the hurdle so far.
Okay, thank you for that.
David?
Thanks, Chair. Look, I should talk about this issue about the housing mix in public and social housing. You touched on it before about this issue of, I guess, the sort of large aggregations of social housing in one place, and how the conventional wisdom is that it's probably better to have a more mixed sort of environment. It seems to me that's probably been the conventional wisdom for decades, and yet the system of having, large aggregations of public housing in one place without that mixture seems to still persist. Is that the issue because of the state government doesn't want to take any of the value of that existing housing off their balance sheet? Is that the main reason why that's the case?
Yes.
And so if, for instance, state government said, we are going to free up, so let's just take the example if you've got 100 units in one facility, and they said, we're going to, whether it's lease or sell or whatever, some proportion of those units, use that money to buy in some other place, and so there's no decline in the public housing stock, but that it's more diversified across the community. What's stopping them from doing that?
I really don't know what's stopping them doing that, and I think it's the land and housing in particular. I know you're from New South Wales. Land and housing in particular, their mandate has been to be commercially viable, so they try and sell off some and create additional homes, but the net increase in homes has been pretty much zero for public housing. That mentality has to be changed, and I try and talk to them about where did this mandate come from? Is it a sacred cow? Because we know all sacred cows make the best burgers. Let's just change the dynamic right now, and let's work together. You've got to change it from the top, and you've got to have consistency of leadership through the policy. Right now, we've had changes in ministers, so there's been, every time a new minister comes in, there's a different dynamic. You believe that you're getting traction. I think we're getting traction now, much more than we ever had before, because we've created outcomes independent of government, and now they see that the proof of concept model is actually working.
But isn't it, it seems to me it's not just, this is, like, it would be, 40 years since the conventional wisdom in your sector was to build these large developments. And yet, they still exist largely in that form in many places, even though, hardly anyone would advocate that as the best policy. So, but basically it's not clear to you as to why that persists. Do you think it's possible to solve that?
Yeah, I think what's happened is that community housing has evolved rather rapidly over the last 5 years, and they've become quite sophisticated. I don't come from not-for-profit, I come from the commercial sector.
Yeah.
I led large organisations throughout Asia-Pac in a commercial perspective.
Yeah.
I chose to come to this and have a commercial head and a social heart to get those outcomes.
Yeah.
And I think you see more and more community housing has that.
Yeah.
As now boards are also now skills-based, and we have very mapped to strategies, and these are true non-executives. Private sector is starting to see that.
Yeah.
So they're getting more and more confidence, and that's evolved
Yeah.
over the last number of years. And we've had proof of concept. I don't say it would have been there 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah.
We're doing more and more things now.
Yeah.
And I think government is also seeing the sophistication of the community housing sector. And I think there will be some traction. It just hasn't happened.
And is there clear evidence, if you line up the outcomes for tenants and the overall environment in a social housing facility that's run by a third party such as yourself, and one that continues to be run directly by the government? My understanding, I think in my electorate there are both. Is it clear that the facilities are better run by third parties than by government, or is it much of a muchness?
No, it's clear that we actually provide outcomes around community, because we provide the wraparound services and the pathway for them.
Yeah.
So if we see that a person needs to be assisted from a mental perspective, we'll get a support provider in. If we see a person has educational problems, we have educational financial assistance, for instance, so that kids don't miss out on their soccer boots or don't miss out on going to school camps. We have partnerships with training organisations. We've actually educated 60 people who were unemployed previously by working through our training partner, and now they've got jobs. We have friendship age networks where elderly come in that speak multiple languages and call the elderly to make sure they're okay. So it's all those wraparound services and community engagement that creates different outcomes.
So what's the best argument in favour of government itself managing these facilities rather than third parties?
We can move them through. We can move them through the system.
The alternative, the argument, why will, sort of looking at another way, what's the rationale for government to manage this stock itself, leaving aside the issue of ownership, but actually managing it, rather than third parties?
I don't think there's any rationale for government. I don't know why they haven't passed it across in the first place. Because if you really look at, let's say, a public house, and I really think it's a pathway we need to talk about, if a government's collecting rent, they're losing about $1,700 a year on that property. So it's a depreciating liability. If they pass it over to community housing, we collect the rent and collect CRA. We actually make $1,900. We run the company and we create a surplus. That surplus then goes into creating more housing. So there's almost a delta for every public house that is managed by the state, negative 1,700, and then if it's managed by CHPs, it would be a positive.
Okay.
So that to me is just a financial one, yet alone what we can do for the people in moving them through.
And last question, but if there was reluctance on the part of governments to actually transfer the title for those reasons you raised earlier, why couldn't government simply enable third parties to manage the property without, like, why do you have to own it? Why couldn't organisations like yours, through just some contract, if you have greater capacity to manage the properties than government, why couldn't that just be done under a contractual arrangement? Why do you need to actually own the property?
Oh, we don't have to own it, but I think it's a hybrid mix of both, because currently we just have 3-year management leases, and obviously you can't do anything with that. But if we had, say, 25-year leases, you can go to a bank and you could leverage those forward revenues to be able to create additional outcomes. So on those revenues, you could go and say, well, I'm going to take this piece of land and create higher density, have social and affordable. So it's a hybrid mix. Some banks want title, some want longer-term leases, but I think it's not all title or it's not all leases. It could be, here's some here and this is what you have to give us back. But if it was long-term leases like 25 or 30, that would be fantastic as well.
Okay, thank you.
Kevin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, actually, my question was similar to Mr. Coleman's, but it was about, the example you gave before of the 5 houses and $1 million each, and let's change the whole mix of how that works. So Mr. Coleman's asked all the questions I wanted to ask, but just you said at the moment there's a proposal have been put to state government, and state government are coming back, if you like, with the different models that you put. When's that due?
Well, that's a moving target. We originally were told June. Now it's late August. They had to sift through 600, I believe, proposals. And I think they'll probably choose 2 or 3 to go to EOI. So there's probably going to be another 6 months after that. So it's how long's a piece of string, to be honest.
And anecdotally, what are you hearing? What do you think will be?
I'm hearing that they're probably going to be making some decisions shortly, and shortly by end of August. But then you have to go into a phase of EOI, and we're not sure how long that process will take. So we're still trucking along, working with, local councils and others to try and get access to land, create outcomes on a 99-year lease and those kinds of things. But the big bang is if we get access to state and federal land.
If you had to rate the importance of the 3 levels of government with this, who's the most important? Because I often find with this local government can be the major determinant with what they're doing and their development approvals. And
yeah, that's once again a tough one. Each one is a challenge to everyone because of the planning control systems and Section 94s in local government, whether they believe in higher density or not, whether they believe in community or not, and and it's great to get them on board around that good high density done well or medium density done well. But I think the federal government plays a huge part in affecting the system. I think specifically around the rent setting or 25% of your income. The other thing I think that the federal government could do is around Centrelink payments, for instance. I think having a roof over your head is one of the most paramount things for you to get better health and education and everything else. And collecting the rent is important for us to function. We ask people to sign to say we'll automatically deduct from your Centrelink your housing. They walk around to the Centrelink office and take that off, right? So federal policy could say,
stop there.
Number 1 is housing comes off your Centrelink payment first because you want them to have a house to get education, health and all those kinds of things. Right now that's not happening. And so if that was to happen, that would be fabulous. And access to information, and so that we can actually house the right people. We don't have access to that information. We don't know. We can't ask someone if they have a house, in wherever, America, Greece or wherever, and we have a lot of people actually take leave of absence of 3 months twice a year. So let's get the right people in there as well.
Yeah.
So I think the federal side of that, access to information, I know there's privacy issues and all that kind of stuff, but we need to do it for the right people who are vulnerable. So they're two things I think that can be done quite effectively.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Maybe just one more question, and thank you for the suggestions for opportunity for reform, because often we get given all the problems but not that many suggestions. But it's a strange amount of evidence that we've had that we've got any number of people in essential services, while they can't afford their home, have now entered the investment housing market. Teachers, nurses, police, ambulance drivers. And the sad story about the police in Warringah living in their cars, and the strange thing might be that they might actually have an investment property. But if we're looking at policy, would it be an idea to allow people in essential services to be able to effectively negatively gear their own home? That is, to be able to deduct the interest component of their mortgage as a way of moving those people in essential services and giving them a further advantage.
I think that'd be a great idea. A great idea.
sorry?
It'd be a good idea.
No, I heard you the first time you said great, I just wanted to hear it again.
Yeah, it's a great idea. The other part of it, I think, that would be important is for those same people to have access to their super to be able to do it. And there's lots of cases out there where you've got a couple or a person is buying a home out of their self-managed super fund, but it can't buy their own home to live in. Yep. So it's almost exacerbated because they could be living in someone's investment, yes, but they can't buy their own home because you're guaranteed the 9.5%, and the banks look at that. So if you actually give people access to the super to be able to buy their first home, it could be another way to look at it.
Slave tenders funding the board. Thank you very much. I think that's all. Thank you very much for
Thank you very
appearing.
much. Appreciate it.
Good work, brother.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm sorry.
You want to leave at 11?
John, Andrea?
1 second. Thank you for your attendance today. If you've been asked to provide additional material, could you please forward it to the Secretariat? You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to which you can make corrections of grammar and fact. As Hansard may wish to check some details concerning your evidence, could you please check if the reporting staff have any questions before you leave? And thank you again.